I'm going to ask you to do the opening sutra.
And surpass penetrating and perfect dharma is rarely met with even 100,000 million kalpas, having it received and listened to, remember and accept. I vow to taste the truth of words, avatars.
Now,
Hey,
three words.
Um,
Yes,
it's there. Somebody was not muted and it sounded like there was vacuuming happening. It was very hard to hear anything. I'm not sure what that was.
is there anybody that's not? Just a second, let me check the gallery.
It's better now.
Might have been me in my refrigerator.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
now a short word on dana. In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understanding of the teachings and practice, it is offered freely as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this practice is done without expectation of getting something in return. This is the spirit of speaking about the Dharma. Other ways to practice dana is to offer those who share the teachings support and to support places of spiritual practice and to give without judgment or expectation when opportunities arise. Those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis. Please support their practice by giving what you can. And in the chat, we have the information for Keiko.
Giving Dana.
Yes, for giving dana. For Koka. Hoko. Sorry.
Coco.
Hoko Karnegis. So I just had the K's and the H's mixed up. The Reverend Hoko Karnegis is ordained as a novice by Shohaku Okumura in 2005 and completed her hossen that same year at Kogetsu-an in Shiga, Japan. She received Dharma transmission in September 2012 and completed Jishu at Eiheiji and Sojiji in November of that year. In January 2016, Hoko was named vice-abbot and successor to Sanshinji. And we welcome you to speak today.
So
All
that's
right.
not all. That's not the end of the story. I told Lorna I wanted to say a few words because this summer I was at Sanshinji and Shohaku was stepping down and Hoko was stepping up. Yep. And they got lots of stuff going on there because Hoko's there. But it's all around Dogen and Dogen translation and helping Shohaku make his books. And I bow to you. Thank you very much, Hoko. And thank you for coming. Fortunately, I caught her. I asked her first for this fall because I knew that she would be hard to catch. And surely, I'm sure that this is squeezed into your um, schedule. So thank you.
Well, good to see everyone. Tejo was one of the first teachers I encountered back in my days in Minnesota. So I have to say, I'm probably sitting here directly because of your teacher's practice. So, you know, we all lift each other up, right? We're all models and examples and inspirations to each other. It doesn't matter where we are on this path, right? We're holding each other up. So as Tejo says, I am at Sanshin Zen Community in Bloomington, Indiana. I succeeded my teacher, who was the abbot, and I said back 7 years ago when they anointed and appointed me, I will not be an abbot. My title is senior Dharma teacher, and I have to say I thrashed around for a while to figure out what was my title going to be. Because in my mind, I mean, Sanshin is not a monastery. We don't do at the time, we didn't even have residential practice. So I went from being vice-abbot, not to being abbot, but to being senior Dharma teacher, which feels actually more like I'm a member of my community and not like I'm sitting on a mountaintop. Not that I don't believe in leadership, because Bodhisattva leadership is actually something I'm really, really interested in. So I think you've heard recently from several of my brothers and sisters about their contributions to this book, Adding Beauty to Brocade. As Teijo mentioned, this was one of the projects of our 20th anniversary, stepping up, stepping down, all of that. So I am the one who conceived of these books. We did one 5 years ago for our 15th anniversary and this one for our 20th. So I was the one who thought it would be a great idea to get all my brothers and sisters around the world to contribute chapters, teachings to a collaborative project, responding to something which I always let Okumura Roshi decide. What's our topic for this book? And then he'll write something and we all respond to that. So it was a way to partner with my siblings across the network, which was important when I was coming in. The first thing I wanted to do was establish a partnership, a good working relationship with everyone. So for this book, I wrote an afterword. I didn't write a chapter like everyone else. I wrote an afterword, which tried to bring together all of these writings about Shishobo and put them in the context of the kind of practice that we do at Sanshin. So you may know that at Sanshin, we don't do many of the things that you will find in Western Dharma centers or in Japanese training temples. So our practice can look pretty bare bones. It can look like it's really kind of tough and austere, and people get this impression. Thank you. Yes, that's the title of the book, Adding Beauty to Brocade. So people get this certain kind of impression about what Sanshin practice is. So you might think we don't do this or that because we don't like it or we don't know how to do it. Actually, most of the time, that's been a very conscious, deliberate decision on the part of our founder, not to do things that distract us from zazen work and study, because this is the style of practice that he inherited from his teacher. So you can read about the 5 points of our practice on our website. I don't have time to go through them all, but those 5 are: we do zazen in a Buddhist context, we keep our forms simple, we balance peace and progress, we do Dharma study as a support for zazen rather than the other way around, and we do work practice as an investigation of community. So it's not just sort of volunteer labor, volunteer work. So those 5 will give you a better idea about what this approach looks like in the real world, in a real community of human beings that are trying to practice together. And it'll tell you something about why we don't do various things that other Dharma centers do. So if I had to sum up Sanshin style in one word, that word would be non-reliance. Over and over again, Sawaki Roshi, Uchiyama Roshi, Okumura Roshi, our 3 immediate ancestors, are pointing us back to the need to give up our habit of relying on something other than our own bodhicitta in our moment-by-moment sort of daily activities. So in the midst of all the instruction from these folks about zazen and sesshin and the translations and interpretations of Dogen's writings and all the discussions about Mahayana form and emptiness, this thing about non-reliance, I think, turns out to be the single most important teaching that they give us. So what happens at Sanshin only really makes sense in the context of non-reliance. And I think that's an exploration of 2 important questions. And one is, what are we relying on to drive our practice? And the other one is, what are we relying on our practice for? Right? So what are we relying on to push, drive, whatever our practice? And then what are we relying on our practice for? So what's pushing us to practice? What are we trying to get out of it? So all around our practice life, these things show up. So we don't rely on a calendar to tell us what ceremonies to do. Ceremonies don't happen just because, well, it's that time again. It's that time of year again or something. Or because that's what we do in Japan, or that's what another Sangha does. They happen because they express something that arises very directly in our own hearts and minds and reflects our own reality of practice. So we don't rely on teachers or practice officers to sort of push us to practice, right? We don't look to the teacher to monitor whether or not we're doing enough zazen, right? Or to tell us sort of how to develop our practice. We go down to the cushion because our bodhicitta puts us there. Our aspiration puts us there. So the teacher isn't making requirements. The teacher isn't setting a curriculum for us and saying, now you do this, now you do that, now you have to do something else, right? So the sense is practice is happening here. You're welcome to join us if you feel moved to do that. If you don't, bless you. But we're not going to come looking for you if you choose not to be here. So it's not that people aren't welcome. It's not that we don't care. It's that people are making their own decisions about their practice. So we also don't rely on our ideas, our fabrications, as Uchiyama Roshi would say, our ideas about stuff. We don't rely on goals, objectives, rewards, to motivate us to practice. We don't rely on sort of shoring up these 5 skandhas into some particular creative identity that makes us separate from something, other people, community. We don't rely on things to make us happy. We don't rely on doctrines to tell us what to believe or how to think. It doesn't mean all of those things are not present in our practice lives. The point is, what's our relationship with them, right? So it's really important to be clear that not making rules and structures is not an oversight. It's not a gap in our org development. I've discovered that often something that feels like an omission is intentional. Nobody actually needs to ride over the hill to point out that we're not doing something or to teach us how to do something because we don't know how to do it. But it also doesn't mean that we kind of throw out all rules and structures, that all rules and structures are bad. We should be living these completely sort of rebellious, anarchic kind of lives, right? How do we balance these things? But if there's a rule, what often happens, I'm sure it happens to you because it happens to me, if there's a rule, we start relying on the rule to tell us what to do, rather than really seeing the reality of this moment. What's arising? What am I being called to do? How am I being called to respond? We don't see the reality of this moment clearly for ourselves. So both the rule and the reality might be pointing us to the same action, but it's easy to rely on the rule to do the work for us, rather than doing our own practice. We do this because the rule says so, not because I see clearly with the eyes of Buddha that this is what needs to be happening right now. So again, what are we relying on to drive our practice and to help us decide what actions to take? So although this teaching is kind of central to what Sanshin does, of course, it didn't start with us, didn't start with our Dharma family. It goes all the way back to Dogen's original question. If Buddha nature is already here, then why do we have to practice? So Okumura Roshi says the basis of our practice is emptiness and interconnectedness. Uchiyama Roshi says we study and practice the Buddha Dharma only for the sake of the Buddha Dharma. Sawaki Roshi, of course, famously said, in essence, Zazen is good for nothing. That's Okumura Roshi's translation of what he said, Zazen is good for nothing. So they're all pointing us back to what Dogen discovered while he was practicing with his teacher, Tendo Nyojo, in China. And, sort of just sit becomes Dogen's final answer to this question. Why do we have to practice? So at the moment, Okumura Roshi is writing his book on the precepts, which I don't know about you, but I'm greatly looking forward to this thing. I think everyone's going to want it. It's going to be fantastic. In this book, which no one has seen but me because I'm helping him do some editing, he says the only thing we can say is that we just sit. We just practice, not because we want to practice, not because we want to be better than who we are now, not for any purpose, but just for the sake of practice and nothing else. So our activities arise from nothing other than our own awakening. But, of course, even calling something our own awakening is a problem, right? Because we don't awaken just because we decide as individuals, well, that seems like a good idea. I think I'll do that today, right? Doesn't work like that. So awakening is what sits in the intersection of this personal self, small self, wanting to take refuge in the 3 treasures and to start to practice, and the universal self sort of accepting that, including that small self as part of its complete living activity and function. And Dogen, of course, calls this Zenki, total dynamic functioning. So we return to that interconnectedness for direction as we practice and as we walk down this path together. So our own awakening doesn't mean our own opinions, our mental fabrications. We can't say, well, it doesn't matter what the teacher or the Sangha is asking of me because I'm relying only on my own awakening to decide what to do. So whatever I do, whatever I decide is always right. That's the yardstick, right? No. Returning to our own awakening really means letting go of this dominance of the small self. It means letting go of being pulled around by our ideas about what these 5 skandhas are. So not relying on others to drive our practice doesn't make us oblivious to how well we're folding into the community, how well we're upholding the harmony in our Sangha with our Dharma brothers and sisters. It's actually just the opposite, right? We take responsibility for that because we are part of it, right? The health of the interconnected network is our responsibility because we and our awakening are integral to that. So how can we not, we're already a part of that. How can we not be responsible for that? So for example, rather than waiting for someone else to correct our forms, we pay attention. We wake up to notice, oh, everyone else is in gasho and I'm in shashu. Or, oh, I forgot to bow to my cushion like everyone else when I got up from zazen. Or, oh, everyone else's utensils are back on their bowls after seconds and mine are still on the table, right? We pay attention and go, oh, I'm not folding in somehow. There's something here I missed. So this really comes from Uchiyama Roshi, or at least in my mind, because he really wanted people to wake up without him having to point them to the things that weren't happening, right? There was a sign, I took one of his quotes and put it on the bulletin board at Sanshin for a while, which had to do with, he would go through the front hall every day and see shoes like everywhere, piles of just shoes. People would come in and there would go the shoes, and he would straighten them up and he would straighten them up and he would straighten them up, hoping that someday somebody was going to wake up and go, wait a minute. Coming in the door and kind of shoes going everywhere is not, it's actually a reflection of our practice, right? And I kind of put that there because that was happening at Sanshin. I was spending an awful lot of time straightening up shoes. So I just thought, when you come back from zazen, you notice that your shoes are not where they were and that things are lined up, would you not go, wait a minute, there was something here that that happened that I should pay attention to, right? So, I think this is, I don't know about you, Tejo, but I think this happens to teachers. We kind of do things and go, someday, folks are going to notice what's happening. In fact, one day I asked Okumura Roshi, have you really just sort of been waiting all this time for us to wake up and figure this out? He just busted out laughing. It's like, man. So, non-reliance, I think, is what makes our practice genuine. It's what makes it authentic because we're not relying on anything other than what is arising in this moment and our sort of wise, compassionate response to that. So it's not that we're not supported by Sangha friends, by advice from teachers, by precepts and sutras and sesshin schedules and work assignments and all the things that go with practicing in a Sangha. It's not that those things aren't meaningful. It's not that they're not valuable. It's not that we should throw them out. But we don't sort of just sit back and let those things carry us along down the stream of practice. We have to do our own practice based on our own bodhicitta without attachment to particular outcomes. So this is a risky approach, I think, really. If you like your practice life to be neat and organized and well-regulated, right? This seems like a recipe for chaos. It's like, how can you run a community this way? The reality is that without direction and correction, we're going to make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. We're going to misunderstand for a while. We're going to get stuck in our own ideas. And there probably won't be any immediate correction unless we're paying attention and watching for this ourselves. So it may take some time before we understand what's being communicated, either with words or without words, right? So for instance, in our style of sesshin, there is absolutely no talking. So there's no correction. I don't make any corrections unless things are really about to go off the rails. I mean, somebody's really about to do something pretty egregious that's going to create disharmony or going to create inconvenience or something, right, in the Sangha. I watch the same people make the same mistake every day for 5 days. One or more times a day and never notice. And I just have to kind of laugh because this is the human condition, right? Especially in sesshin, tunnel vision sets in. I'm here to do my sesshin, I'm focusing on my zazen, and I think I'm being very mindful and concentrated because I'm only looking here, right? We lose broad awareness because we think concentration means having this view. So I don't look around and notice everyone else is in Ishu and I'm in Shashu, right? I just do this. So I kind of step back and go, well, bodhicitta at some point is going to kick in. I watch people stand next to a sign on the wall. Maybe this happens in your place too. Next to a sign on the wall that says, please don't do this, doing exactly what the sign says, please don't do. I put a sign on the bookshelf that says, we don't read or study during Sesshin, and I watched people come up and next to the sign, get the book out of the shelf and sit on the couch and settle down for some Dharma study. It's like, come on, right? So, I have to wait for them to wake up. I've done the same thing, I'm sure, myself. I'm sure my teachers at some point despaired that I would ever get it. But it's a really interesting approach to practice. I don't go running over and go, oh, wait a minute, no. At some point, awakening kicks in, right? So there are forms, signals, reference points, even during the silent times in our practice that are indications of what's coming next and what are we doing together and how do we pay attention. And, if we're watching for those things, it's a very subtle, beautiful, interesting system of communication that happens within our practice forms, which is another whole talk, because I think that's a really interesting kind of thing. So within non-reliance, we're also not going to be able to motivate ourselves by measuring our progress, whatever we think that is, with praise or recognition or promotions or rewards or something, right? Because there's no benchmark we can actually use. The zazen of someone who's been doing zazen for 30 years is not different than the zazen of somebody who learned to sit last week. Zazen is zazen. That space is the same space. So it puts everybody into the same space, and then there's no comparing. So there's no yardstick. There's no benchmark. So Uchiyama Roshi taught zazen is really the only true teacher, the most venerable and truest teacher or something, in his 7 points in the back of Opening the Hand of Thought, right? He's got like 7 points of practice, and one of them is zazen is the true teacher. So if so, then falling in love with a human teacher, and believe me, I come from a place where everyone falls in love with the founder, falling in love with a human teacher, trying to build something called a teacher-student relationship, or approaching Zen only as an academic study, or entering into this practice or into Buddhism as a philosophy rather than as a practice, or a lifestyle, all kind of miss the mark, right? We can't rely on any of those things alone to motivate us. So you can fall in love with a teacher, you can decide this is an academic study, you can decide this is a lifestyle for me, and none of those things are really going to motivate us to sincerely practice. So at the same time, Okumura Roshi has pointed out that thinking about what drives our practice is actually a real conundrum, because relying on our zazen or awakening or bodhicitta can still create some attachment. We need a motivation to practice, but we also need to be free from clinging to that motivation. So I mentioned his precepts book a minute ago. So in another place in that book, he says, I practice because I want to be a better, non-selfish person, and that desire allows me to practice. We need to go through continuous hard practice, and yet when we practice for a certain period of time, we find that our motivation to practice is still part of the self-centeredness that wants to make this person better. We find that even in our aspiration to practice, there is a muddy part. Facing this problem brings us to the dead end. We can't go further because the driving power to practice is itself a problem, and yet we can't stop practicing and return to the mundane world. This is the final barrier, and that's why Sawaki Roshi said that zazen is good for nothing. Until we go through that difficulty, we don't really understand this teaching of Sawaki Roshi that our zazen does not need to be good for nothing. Interesting, right? So even though we're trying to find, the thing to rely on to drive our practice, we can cling to that too. So there's always this little, as he says, a little muddy part, right? A little bit of self-clinging in there. So one of the critical discoveries I made while investigating Sanshin style is that there's really supposed to be a community in Sanshin Zen community. Who knew? Because historically, we've not been great at community. I mean, Tejo was in there from the beginning. Historically, we've not been great at community, right? And yet, turns out, community was always supposed to be the center of this thing. Now, you might say, well, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, how did you miss that? How was there not community in the middle of this thing? In fact, I learned that the whole point of Sanshin, in the mind of our founder, is to enable the deep investigation of interconnectedness as it manifests in community. So community was always supposed to be a huge gateway. And interestingly, the investigation was interconnectedness. So this is not why most people would think they were coming to a Dharma center, right? That doesn't sound like a Dharma center kind of mission. There's nothing there about, well, we're going to sit zazen and, be Buddhas, right? So it never actually made it into the original mission statement. I have since asked the board to change that, and it has. So if you look at our mission statement now, it's all about investigating interconnectedness as it manifests in community. So it's only within, on that basis then, it's only within the last year or two that we have put residential practice at the center of what we do. Up to that point, it had been nice to have maybe one day a week at a time kind of thing. And, I kind of moved it really to the middle. So that's all great, but how can non-reliance be our approach if the point of this thing is to investigate interconnectedness? Those two things don't seem to go together, right? Non-reliance sounds like we're cut off from everything around us. We're functioning independently of everything around us because we're not relying on anything, right? We're islands unto ourselves in some way. Standing on our own 2 feet, doing for ourselves, making our own decisions, like these things seem to be incompatible. And I had to stop and think about this when I kind of, after many conversations with Okumura, I had to go, okay, now how are these things going to fit together? So in America, with our tendency toward rugged individualism, right? We like to be individuals. Teachings about non-reliance might seem like a sort of a license to cut ourselves off, to use our own likes and dislikes as the ultimate yardstick. You might be familiar with Sawaki Roshi's teachings on group stupidity. Anyone heard of his teachings on group stupidity? Gurupaboku, group stupidity? Yep. We read those things and we go, yep, that's it. Yep, amen. So he says, we live in group stupidity and confuse this insanity with true experience. It is essential that you become transparent to yourself and wake up from this madness. Zazen means taking leave of the group and walking on your own 2 feet. One at a time, people are still bearable, but when they form cliques, they start to get stupid. They fall into group stupidity. They're so determined to become stupid as a group that they found clubs and pay membership dues. Zazen means taking leave of group stupidity. And we go, yep. This sounds like we should rely on our own opinions. Of course, all of these groups that believe something other than what I believe, well, it's ridiculous to get caught up in that sort of mob psychology. We go, yeah, I get what he's saying. Well, that's okay from a point of view of my own awakening is telling me that my way is the one true way. My interpretation is always the best. So, Sawaki is so right. Well, that's a pitfall in our practice, right? We can kind of really go off the rails there. If we're not relying on a teacher to step in and manage our practice, then how does that dynamic get resolved? How do we not just run roughshod over other Sangha members or get run over ourselves by others in the name of this thing we're calling non-reliance? Is there a way to reconcile not being reliant on Sangha with being completely interconnected with Sangha? So, here's the key point. Non-reliance doesn't mean disconnection. It would be easy to go non-reliance, my hands are off of everything. Non-reliance does not mean disconnection. And of course, we know disconnection is actually not possible. We can't actually do it. If we think so, that's our idea. So one of the challenges of non-reliance as a style of practice is that it's really subtle and it's open to misinterpretation. If we bring our own ideas to it and we're not looking clearly, we can come to the wrong conclusion. It's easy to assume that we don't do complex rituals because we don't like them, or, that our teachers are non-directive because they just don't care what we do, or that we don't have a training system because it's not important for clergy or leaders to develop core competencies. We could also assume that not being reliant on something to give us an identity or not relying on someone to drive our practice is the same as not being connected to that thing or connected to that person. So when you and I meet in the space of awakening, when all of us meet in the space of awakening, we all see with the eyes of Buddha. So we don't need to tell each other in that space what to do. We don't need to cling to ideas or create an identity for these 5 skandhas. We recognize we are interconnected with everything else. We always have been interconnected with everything else, and we're not reliant on any of that to determine our actions for us or to determine our understanding for us. In that space, we see reality the same way Buddha sees it. And we see what we need to do in order to create and maintain a wholesome community right in the midst of both non-reliance and interconnectedness. So the way we say that around here is we're able to see one reality from 2 sides and express 2 sides in one action. So that's a phrase that we use a lot around here. So we might think of non-reliance as this sort of concrete manifestation of emptiness, right? So this is what we do based on how things are. We look around, we see clearly how things are, and on that basis, we know what action to take, how to behave. So we can ask ourselves about the basis for our relationship with all the dharmas that we encounter. So what do I expect from my relationship with, fill in the blank, right? My shoes, my roommate, my breakfast, my memories, my teacher, whatever that is. What am I expecting out of that relationship? Am I relying on these things to build my identity or motivate my actions or drive me to practice or something? And what does that look like? What's truly going on there? So not relying on things does not mean they don't exist. It doesn't negate their existence. It doesn't negate our relationship to them, right? Not relying on things doesn't mean those things aren't there, and doesn't mean we're not connected and that we don't have a relationship with them. The true reality of things is not the product of our relationship with them. This doesn't have validity because it's useful to me, right? This thing that's not what that relationship is about. So the reality of that is not about what I think about it. Just like the true self is not the self that we fabricate out of our ideas, right? So the problem, of course, is our habit of clinging, grasping. Clinging to anything creates suffering. So when we are suffering, we can ask ourselves, what am I relying on for my comfort, for my happiness, for my peace of mind? What's really driving that, right? If I'm feeling uncomfortable, where is reliance in that? So we might rephrase Sanshin's practical investigation of interconnectedness as it manifests in community as an investigation of what it means not to be reliant on Sangha while being completely interconnected with Sangha. So as Okumura has said, independence is important, but isolation is not necessary. I think that's a really interesting something to investigate, right? So what does all this mean when new folks show up in the Sangha? Because that was all of that was well and good when I started to understand what that meant for people who were here. But then you've got to think about, we've got new people, as I'm sure you do, coming all the time. How do we not just sort of reject them, right? How do they become part of this community? How do we welcome them and still point them toward non-reliance? Because it might sound like practice in this style is kind of an unorganized free-for-all. And if you're coming in the door for the first time, don't you need basic information, basic instruction, resources to get started, all of those things? And of course, yes, we all do. We all had a first day in the Zendo, right? We all had a first time on the cushion. We all remember what that was like. Somebody was helping us. Non-reliance doesn't mean that doesn't happen, right? This is not a case where practitioners are left on their own to thrash around until somehow, they create some method for themselves. That would be kind of irresponsible and not very friendly. And that's not what Sangha is about. So, of course, in most community organizations, not necessarily even just Dharma centers, but any volunteer group we're a part of or any community organization, there's a clear intake process for newcomers, to give them all the information they need, because of course we want them to hang around. We want them to continue providing energy and volunteering and making donations and being part of the program and, all of those things. So because this particular style of practice has a lot of subtleties and the reason for things are not very obvious, newcomers frankly can feel challenged. If we're not very careful, they can feel like they're in the way. They can feel like they're disregarded. And of course, that's not what anybody wants, right? So it takes a certain amount of, you have to be a skillful community, right, for this thing to work. It's not obvious to new people what they should be doing. There may be nobody kind of running up to help them and hold their hands and make them feel okay and make them feel comfortable. Of course, many people will expect a very efficient, expert Western training system method designed to build self-confidence or self-esteem, right? And that's not, anyone who's practiced in Japan, Teijo will tell you, that is not the way training happens. I can't tell you how many times when I was in Japan, Westerners would arrive, be completely at sea, and the next thing out of their mouths was, now, I'd be happy to make some handouts. And we go, that's not the way we learn. It's not that we don't know how to make the handouts. That's not the way we learn, right? But it can feel very disorienting. If you know how to ride that wave, it's actually a wonderful practice opportunity. But for someone who's brand new to this practice, and to maybe a non-Western approach to learning, that can feel kind of disruptive, right? So this lack of direction, lack of correction, lack of emphasis on, it's emphasis on non-reliance can be a bit confusing. So especially for people who are timid or people who are proud or self-conscious, fearful of making embarrassing mistakes. That's not okay in this culture. That's not okay with our little 5 skandhas, right? We don't want to make embarrassing mistakes. We're anxious to join everything as quickly as possible, to kind of get into the in crowd, right? As quickly as possible, all the people who know what to say and what to do and all the buzzwords, and right? I mean, that's where we want to be. We don't want to be on this outer fringe going, I don't know what's going on. That doesn't feel okay. So once we teach folks to sit, and we do some basic orientation to practice and to the Sangha, then we actually ask them, pay broad attention to what's going on around you. This is not a place where we're going to run up and correct you. Now, for some people, they go, phew, nobody's going to come up and publicly correct me, right? But we say, please watch, please notice, please follow what's happening around you, learn what's going on, copy what others are doing, fold yourself in. Don't hesitate to ask the relevant questions and investigate for yourself what's going on. Ask about what you don't understand, but we're not going to run up and give you that question, right? You need to do your work. You need to do the practice and figure out where your gaps are and ask for whatever help you need. Rely on ask for the resources that you need, to fill the gaps. So we tell you, we're glad you're here. We wish you well. There's no curriculum. There's no roadmap. Nobody's going to be pushing you, pulling you along in the practice. We all need to have enough diligence to stick with it based on our own bodhicitta, because, in the world, nothing is handed to us. We leave the zendo. We're practicing. Yeah, we're being held up by all the Buddhas and ancestors, but, right, we're kind of on our own. So this is not a setup which is guaranteed to maximize organizational growth. I worked for the government for years. This is not a setup that's designed to increase the size of your membership exponentially. This makes good board members very nervous, because good board members want to put your program in front of as many eyeballs as possible. But, the number of practitioners in residence, the number of practitioners in a zendo or in a sangha is not a meaningful measure of success for us, because this style of practice, frankly, is not for everyone. This makes sustainability a challenge for us, right? I can't just sort of go out the front door and, do a wellness fair or something and get a lot of new members, because, you need to be committed to practice in a certain way. This doesn't make our practice better or worse than anyone else, but we have a very particular voice in sort of the national conversation, which, Teijo helped us to get started with and to preserve. So I feel like it's important not to lose that voice. So this is a fairly intensive kind of practice. It doesn't offer all the broader range of topics and supportive activities and cultural things found in many American Dharma centers today. It's good that those things are available somewhere, because they're not available here. So someone who's really interested in those things in this day and age, you can find that, but Sanjin concentrates very particularly on those 5 things that I mentioned right in the beginning today. And that's really all we do. So we tell people we only do 4 things in our zazen. We take the posture, we keep the eyes open, we breathe deeply through the nose, we open the hand of thought. That's all we're doing in zazen. So we're pretty tightly focused on this practice style, and we don't deviate much just to make people comfortable, right? So if you want to do this practice, you have to kind of be committed to doing this particular kind of practice. So our practice doesn't require some kind of superior intelligence. It doesn't require perfect physical capacity, which is good, because I would never make it. My back wouldn't allow me to do sesshin. It doesn't require some encyclopedic knowledge of the sutras. It doesn't require that we all, can perform ceremonies perfectly or do complex liturgy perfectly. It does require us to be self-sufficient in a certain kind of way. It requires us to be flexible, to let go of whatever our ideas are about practice, our yardsticks about practice. We're not relying on those things, both either to push us forward or to say, yes, you're a good boy, you're a good girl, you've done this thing. I think this practice style requires a certain amount of courage. If you're not sure what you can rely on, It takes some courage to go forward step by step by step and say, well, I'm going to do the next thing and do the next thing, and I'm going to pay attention to my bodhicitta. I'm going to take advantage of the guidelines, the resources around me without clinging to them in such a way that I obscure my own vision. I think it requires some dedication. Teachers are not going to go get us and put us on the cushion. We're not relying on what our neighbors, our Sangha friends think of us in our practice. So it can't be about that ego-driven kind of stuff. The dedication has to come from someplace. We have to be free from self-involvement. We can't be doing this in order to get something out of it, in order to get some ego reward or validation for time served, or, and you can watch how those things creep in, right? Well, I'm going to take the precepts because, I think I ought to wear a rakusu because I've been doing this a long time and people should know that. Right? I mean, we get all kind of, right? It gets really muddy. What exactly is the involvement of self? How is self, our ideas about self, pushing us, how are those things pushing us forward or pulling us along? I'm going to practice because I want to be somebody, or I want to be somebody I like better, right? We need to be free from this need for constant validation. If we're relying on validation, what are we doing? And validation comes in a lot of forms. You are somehow promoted to be your teacher's assistant in something. Oh, that's, there's big ego there. That's a validation way. I'm going to keep practicing because, I've got this kind of promotion, or I've got this public role, right? Which is different from being an example. That's, if your job is to be a shuso or a teacher and be an example, that's a different kind of thing. But, so all of these things, flexibility and courage and dedication and this freedom from self-involvement, and freedom from this need from constant validation. This is all tied up with non-reliance. So what is pushing our practice forward? So instead, we simply follow our teacher's example. We join with our teachers in their practice or in the practice, but we're doing our own work, right? So, Teijo could be sitting 8 hours a day every day. She's not going to require you to do that. It's up to your bodhicitta to come and sit there, virtually or in person or whatever. That's what's getting us to practice. So this is what I called in the title of this talk, connection without dependence, right? We're connected, we're not dependent. So this is connection without dependence, or non-reliance in our practice. So we have a few minutes here. I'm interested in what you all might like to say or ask, reflections on any of this as it relates to your own practice, or anything you'd like to say this morning. And I'm going to assume that somebody else is facilitating, otherwise I can call on people. What's your pleasure?
We don't have a facilitator.
Well, I've done it so many years of my life. Either put up a hand or jump in. I don't need to call on you if you want to just open your mic and have your say. What would folks like to say this morning? I've stunned you all into silence.
You have said a lot.
I always do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to say one thing though, and it was in reference to something that specific that you said at the beginning, but also referenced. And that was something that Kadagiri Roshi used to talk about, which is like not correcting and not kind of him not imposing himself on us in some way, and just kind of letting us do I remember him talking about it and thinking, oh yeah, that's such a great thing to just not interfere with our practice. And then I thought, but will it work? you know? And then, but what happened is that after he died, all of a sudden, for me, I started saying, oh, that's what he meant. Oh, that's what he meant. So, it does work.
It does work. And sometimes what I say to people here is just because you're not being corrected doesn't mean you're not making a mistake. right? So it's not my responsibility to be looking at everyone going, you're making a mistake, you're doing it right, you need to do something else, right? Just because I'm not, or somebody isn't running around and correcting us, doesn't mean we're not making a mistake. So Katagiri Roshi was, I suspect, giving you/us the chance to see for ourselves, what is the teacher doing? What is the Sangha doing? Am I folding in an appropriate way? We're not all identical because we have different karmic circumstances. We don't have the same bodies. We don't have the same background. This is not about being carbon copies of each other. This is about everybody carrying the same thing, but in the way that our karmic circumstances want us to carry it, right? So it's kind of an interesting, refreshing space to be in when we all understand the teacher is not coming around to correct everything we do. It's not that teacher's responsibility to make sure we're all doing something perfectly. It's our responsibility to look at the teacher and maybe the seniors, depending on their roles, and say and to feel our own aspiration to practice like they practice, right? So when I look at how my teacher practices, I learned to bow watching my teacher bow. I knew full well physically how to bow, but it was really interesting. I mean, starting back in Minnesota and then all the way here, to watch how he bows, I learned something from that. It's not magic. It's not, let's not get precious about it. It's not, woo-woo stuff. But there was something being expressed there, which I thought was really interesting. And even today, whenever I bow, there's something in here going, bow like your teacher. If we can take those opportunities, because, speaking from this side, it's really interesting to me. I'm not doing I'm just doing my practice. I'm often not doing something in order to demonstrate something. And I'll be interested in Teijo's comments on this when I'm done. I'm not doing something in order to be a model or in order to do something. I'm simply practicing what's in my body to practice. And then someone will come up and say, oh, I really learned something, or I really got something, or I was, some aspiration arose because of what I saw you do. I thought, well, on the one hand, isn't that fantastic? Dharma's being transmitted. And on the other hand, I thought, well, that's terrifying. People are looking at what I'm doing and I better do it right? But that's about my ego. That's all about my ego. So, can we, as a Sangha, as a community, look to each other, watch each other, and fold into that? Because, of course, there's something that happens in a Sangha which is bigger than the individuals in the Sangha, right? I frequently have to tell people here, when it comes to Sesshin, most of the people who come to Sesshin, and maybe this is true for your community as well, don't actually live here. They're coming from, maybe a few hours away, sometimes from a long way away. Historically, that was a problem for us in terms of community because community never got a foothold. I had people coming literally from all over the world for 5 days. We'd have a pop-up community and then everyone would leave. And the next one, a whole different group would come and then they would leave. So building community was difficult. Now we've got sort of what I call a Sesshin core. We've got a group of people regionally, that come all the time. And I've had to remind people, there is no Sesshin without participants. If everyone's leaving early, about the last few hours, people start sidling up to me and go, now, I'm going to be leaving early. I've got a 6-hour drive. And I'm going, if there's no participants, there's no Sesshin. If there's no Sangha members, there's no Sangha. There's something that happens there. And again, it's not magic. There's some practice that happens there, which is bigger than the individual. So how do we fold ourselves into that without relying on it, right? How are we connected with that functioning without relying on its drive of practice? It's a really interesting question. So Teijo, I'm interested in your thinking, your experience about modeling practice and what gets transmitted without correction in your community, in your life.
Well, from the time I had to start teaching, Katagiri Roshi told us to teach. That's why I'm teaching. But from the time I started, I thought, okay, Katagiri Roshi's greatest teaching was simply his practice. And this is all I have to do. But that's hard. But I truly believe that. Look at Shohaku. His teaching is his practice. Right? That's what draws people to him. It's certainly not his organizational skills.
Absolutely not. However, I'm glad you said that because, of course, so many people arrive at Sanshin because of the books. and they read the books and they fall in love with him the way he writes about Dogen. And so, I want to go to Sanshin, I want to practice there. The books don't really tell us about his practice. People come to Sanshin and they're surprised, because what they sort of their impression of him is, he's a gentle guy, he's very humble, he's very kind, he's very quiet, and they think practice is going to be very soft. Even if they've read the Antaiji Sesshin chapter of Opening the Hand, they arrive. What they don't see, and what I didn't see until I started practicing in the Zendo every day, was the iron backbone, right? I mean, there's something going on which you don't get from the books. So on the one hand, I think it's great that the books bring people in, but as you say, the teacher's greatest teaching is actually the practice. So if we're relying only on, I'm going to read the books and get it, and you were fortunate in that you actually practiced with your teacher for your formative years. I didn't. I was 700 miles away. I didn't practice, regularly, like day after day after day at Sanshin until 7 years ago when I arrived as the successor. So I've had a very steep learning curve. And I can feel to this day the gap for me in not being able to spend all that time, in the Zendo with my teachers, just watching what he does and getting whatever, just watching the practice. I got that a bit in Japan because I actually spent more time with teachers there, like sort of every day. But there is something about that, the teacher's teaching is the practice. So what are we relying on there? We're simply going to fold ourselves in. We're going to watch what's going on. We're going to participate wholeheartedly with no gaps. That is the transmission. So did I cut you off, Tejo? Did you have other things you'd like to say?
Oh, I could always just go on and on, but why don't we open it up?
What would others like to say? Questions, reflections, ideas that come to you, David?
So one of the things that struck me about your talk, Hoko, and I appreciate you coming to talk because I listened to one of your 5-minute Dharma talks earlier. Oh. And I was like, okay, this is different. This is a different approach to practice. And when we first started your talk, I thought this is different. This is not me. This is not going to work for me. And then I realized I'm 100 miles away from Great Tree. I can't rely on Great Tree. I can't rely on Tejo-san for everything. I have to do it myself. I have to be my own practitioner. And that's what I've been doing for the last several months, is learning, watching on video, being up at Great Tree once now so far. I'll be up there for Sesshin this next weekend, and learning from watching and practicing. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, during the pandemic, we all got a crash course in non-reliance in a certain kind of way, right? Because we were all practicing solo. We couldn't get together in person with our teachers, with our sanghas. Our schedules were disrupted, our lives were disrupted. We kind of had to think about what is this new normal, right? So we all were thrashing around for a bit, figuring out what do I rely on now, right? And not everybody stuck with it, and people got pulled away into other things. I mean, I don't know about your community, but mine, there's a number of people I've not seen back since the pandemic. Their lives took over, right? It happens to everybody. We've got new people that have arrived since then, and that happens in every community. So, one of the first things I did during the pandemic was put up on the website a page I called Sanshin Solo, which just said, here's all the resources for practicing on your own, because suddenly the things we were relying on are not available anymore, right? So those of us, and having, as I just said, I was a long distance practitioner, I was watching his talks on Facebook from hundreds of miles away. I know what that life is, right? We're fortunate we've got things like this where we can sort of get together, right? So again, we have to be careful about confusing non-reliance with disconnection. This is not saying we shouldn't take advantage of the guidance, the support, the encouragement, all of that goes with being part of a community, because that's really important. Sangha is one of the 3 treasures, and there's a reason for that, right? We need that. But yeah, in many ways, no matter where we are, this non-reliance thing is not missing. I mean, we might frame it differently than other sanghas will, although, as I say, this goes all the way back to Dogen. It's like, we didn't make this up. This is not branding for market differentiation. This is just, we focus on practice in a particular way. So if that's useful to you as a solo, that's good. And please stay connected, with your Sangha to the degree you can. What would other folks like to say or ask? Deborah, please.
Hey, thank you for your talk. I just spent a week at Tassajara for Sangha Week. Kiko was there.
Yeah.
And she's doing well.
Good.
And what comes up for me often when I do, and this was pretty informal, and it really helped me because I think I've built up some fear of doing sashins because I have chronic insomnia. And it's really hard for me to get up early. And I really struggle with, keeping the schedule, supporting my other Sangha members, and self-care.
Mhm.
And I managed to get up every morning that week, except for, I guess the bell was lost one morning, so nobody came around to wake us up. But but I did it. But then some days I was tired the whole day. So it's always, and I guess that's just the muddy area. I don't know if you have any thoughts or advice, but it's just something I struggle with.
Sure. Well, the reality is you have a physical condition which makes it hard for you to sleep. That's not. We don't need to have an opinion about it. That's the reality of it, right? So we needed to act and move and practice on that basis. There will be days where you need extra rest. Your body needs extra rest because that's your karmic circumstance, right? So one hopes that we're always in a situation which is flexible enough that we can accommodate that reality, recognize that reality. That's not your opinion. You're not trying to be different. You're not being selfish. You don't have some idea that you need things more than other people need them, right? The reality is some days your body needs extra rest. So we don't need to have an opinion about that. As soon as we do, that's ego, right? And yet that's easy for me to say. It's that's easy for me to just say, oh well, we need to not have an opinion about that, and because we always feel like we don't want to stick out, right? But that's why I say, we can be doing the same practice, but we're not identical. We have different karmic circumstances. When we look at the differences in practice style between Uchiyama Roshi and Sawaki Roshi, it's like night and day, right? And Uchiyama Roshi knew that. He was physically weak. He had never so much as washed his own handkerchief before he came to practice. He came from an affluent enough family that, he didn't do anything for himself. So he's a very different person than Sawaki Roshi, who had been in the military, who'd lived a tough life, who'd had a tough life since he was young, and had, this kind of lion personality. And Uchiyama Roshi said, if I keep practicing, can I become like you? He said, absolutely not. And that's why we have this image in Uchiyama Roshi's writings about, rose blooms like a rose and a violet blooms like a violet. It's a different karmic circumstance. So it's not about lack of sincerity. It's not about lack of dedication. It's not about lack of bodhicitta. It's about the reality of this moment is my body needs certain things. And we need to take care of that. We need to not get precious about that. We need to not build a lot of ego around that. Oh, poor me. Martyrdom, I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just saying in general, martyrdom is an exercise in ego. It means I have an idea about myself and, how I am in relation to other people. It's not about being extra humble. There's such a thing as humble bragging, which I think is a really whole other interesting dharma, right? Oh, poor me, I had to go out and wash the Bentley this morning. Come on. There's a lot of ego in the poor me. So it can't be about that, but it also can't be about neglecting the body. Body is the ground of our practice. If we're not taking care of this body, what are we doing? We can't practice, right? In this human form, this is what we practice with. So we can't ignore it, suppress it, mortify it, right? We gotta take care of it. So I don't know if that helps you, but as soon as we can take our own sort of need for validation away from those things and say, this is the reality of the moment. What am I going to do? My body needs sleep. I can't change that. I'm doing the best I can to take care of the body as the ground of my practice, and what comes out of that is what comes out of that.
That is very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. All right, we're exactly at the top of the hour, Tejo. Do we want to go a few more minutes if people have questions, or do we need to stop here?
We need to stop here, and I want to mention just a few things. And Hoko mentioned at the beginning about the various people that wrote chapters for this book. And actually, she's the first one to talk from that
Oh,
book.
well,
Yeah. We do have kind of a lineup. Doyu from Rome is going to be speaking. And what's her name from France?
Shoju? Shoju Mahler?
Shoju Mahler. And also from Arkansas, Shoryu. So we have kind of a lineup for this fall. So you have all that to look forward to. And or you can buy the book and read it, which I have put the name of in the chat. Do you want to say anything in closing?
I don't think so. So I'll just say one of the interesting things about this book, by the way, is that I encouraged my brothers and sisters for whom English is not their first language to write in their native language. So everything in here is translated into English, but you will also sometimes find the original chapters in Spanish, Italian, German. If you read another language, it's a fun exercise and a little extra dharma study in your second language. So I'll just let you know about that. So I appreciate the conversation this morning. I hope everyone's doing well, continues to do well. I'm sitting here because of Teijo, so I see a real connection, a continuing connection between our sanghas. I hope the partnership continues there. So, all right. Okay, thank you, everybody.
You have to give back the merit now. May the merit of this practice
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings
benefit all beings
and bring peace.
and bring peace.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.